is a world-renowned scholar and dealer, collector of all things Asian. And he and his lovely wife Gretchen, which is where she's over there, they helped consult on the show. And Don Joint was the curator. So I asked Mark to come talk about this work because I'm sure, although we appreciate it as these beautiful, wonderful things, we may not know a lot about them historically or contextually within the time period which in which they were made. So anyway, reminders, cell phones. Also, when we get to the Q&A section, can you please repeat the question so that we can hear it
That's fine.
On the video?
Yeah, because what I thought is I'd discuss a little history of how I got into it, then I'll explain a few pieces, then we'll take a little break, let everyone look around, and then have the question and answer, because you might see a specific piece you're interested in knowing more about. So I guess...
Oh, turn it over to you.
Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to thank Don for coming down to the gallery and helping me pick out a lot of the pieces. Now, some are from Don's personal collection here. There's a couple from other people's collections, and then a lot of them came from the gallery. We actually picked out more, more than the space could handle, but anyway, I think it turned out really nice because each piece looks, you can study it, and it shows the excellence in craftsmanship per item versus at my gallery, it's like I walk like this according to my wife because I have porcelains on the floors, on the tables and everything. So it's nice for me to see how great it looks actually separated from thousands of other pieces. So the way I got into Japanese art is when I was 13, there was an auctioneer that came to Texas. His name was Harvey Braswell, and my parents would go to his auction. He drove a semi. He'd bring it from the East Coast. He'd do an auction in San Antonio and an auction in Corpus Christi. So I asked if I could get a job there after school because it was interesting to me. So he hired me. So I'd get out of school at 3:30. I'd have my mom beeline me over to help him set up the auction. And so then I said, well, instead of paying me, can I just get one little piece after I've worked enough for you? Can I get something, you know, something that you consider as fair for the work I did? He goes, oh, sure. So like during the auction, I would hold up the piece and walk it around. There'd be like, say, back then auctions were like live in person. So there could be 300 people sitting out here, and I'd have like a Chinese ivory snuff bottle or a jade toggle. So the Netskis, which are the Japanese toggles, we have a selection here. The Netskis were mainly from the 18th and 19th century. They're small, for no better term, button-like toggles. They're usually made of ivory, bone, wood, porcelain, and mixed metal. Those toggles are functional they have an obi sash. The Netski goes on top, the ojimi bead, which Don brought a nice collection that you can see, which holds the top of the 6-case in row from opening the little compartments. So the first piece I ever got was a Netski. He let me get, it was a Saturday auction. It went from like 10 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon. And I said, Mr. Braswell, I really would like to get a Netski. And so he says, well, there's 10 over there in that shelf. You just go pick you out one. So I picked out a little Netski of a kappa. It's a little demon of the sea with a little hat on top of a shell. And it was carved ivory. So that was my first Japanese piece that I ever collected. Then I got all the books right away on Netski, and then I got into snuff bottles, and after that it was everything. I did my first antique show as an exhibitor when I was 16. The youngest exhibitor, I was on the front page of the newspaper, and that was back when long hair was really fashionable. And my friend Fred Heldenfels was helping me at the show, and he had real long hair. We were like in high school. And the wealthiest lady in town, her name was Ada Wilson, who has the Ada Wilson's Children's Hospital. So she comes, now this is my first show, first booth, and here comes this older lady in a wheelchair with like a limousine driver, a nurse. I mean, she had everybody with her. So all the dealers in the show were like chattering it up. So one guy comes over, do you know who that is? I said, no. She says, she's the wealthiest lady in town and she can buy anything she wants. Well, she beelines it to my booth. She says, I'd like to see young people getting into antiques. I saw your picture in the paper. So I said, oh, good. And your girlfriend's real cute. Well, this is, I knew she couldn't see too good, but my friend he had long hair and I laughed. I almost broke out laughing. But I had, because it's like Fred Heldenfels. His parents owned the Heldenfels Construction Company who did all the highways in Texas. So anyway, she says, well, can you show me some things that you have? And I had a Japanese Satsuma porcelain bowl that was really nice. I had a lacquered Chinese table. So she just kind of wheeled into the booth and she goes, this is beautiful. I'll have that. And then she walks over and she'd look at this and she'd go, oh, this will look nice in my home. I'll have that. So she buys like 5 things from me. She never asked the price. I'm like going crazy, right? Because, one bowl was $1,500. And so she says, just write me up an invoice and tell me the amount, and my butler will come back, pay you, and pick everything up. And then she turned around and left the show. And everybody else in the show, all the dealers that had been coming there for like 20 years, 30 years doing the same show, they couldn't believe it, And so that was like my first experience show. So I liked the artwork, there was a good market for the work. So that stirred me on even further. So basically, the Japanese art in general is very diversified. I was probably the #1 dealer in Japanese swords and armor for about 25 years. I sold maybe, a conservative estimate would be 10,000 Japanese swords back to Japan from 12th century up into Showa, which is the contemporary swords. And the sword fittings, same thing. There's a museum in Kyoto. I sold them maybe, I don't know, I'm going to guess $2 to $3 million worth of Japanese sword fittings, which are beautiful subas with dragons and things like that. And it just kept evolving. So then I taught myself to read Japanese signatures. I just studied the characters. So anytime I'd go to a gun show to buy swords, I was at an advantage because my competitors couldn't read the tangs on the swords. And I could read it would say like Bishu Osafuni Skesada, which means Bizen province, Osafuni village, Skesada made. And then the patina on the tang will say if it's, if you look at the patinas. But that I would have piles of swords on my floor and the Japanese would fly in and we'd spend hours sitting on the floor selling them swords. And then I met a gentleman called Flying Cranes Antiques, which was probably the biggest gallery in New York for 30 years. He advertised worldwide, Cliff and Gene Schaefer. So Cliff, we met him, Gretchen and I went to a show and in New York, and we went downstairs and he had beautiful cloisonne, which is enamel fired on copper, silver, or gold. So we have one cloisonne example over here, which is Moriagi cloisonne, which means raised enamel. It's probably, of all the cloisonnes, the rarest is Plique Azur, which is transparent, and then Moriagi. And then from there, it goes to wireless. But so he showed me some vases, and his wife I always get a kick out of because she told him, that kid won't buy anything from you. He's just wasting your time. Well, I ended up going to the shop the next day, and I bought the 2 pairs of vases he showed me. And then he goes, well, we should work together. And I said, well, I got to know how this is going to pan out, I said. So I bought 2 pieces, and one was a beautiful Satsuma urn. And Satsuma is this type of work. It's a crackle white glaze with gilded gold highlights. And there's 3 or 4 famous makers, like Abu Mazan does very small people. He's probably the most valuable. This one's Kinkazon, who had a big studio. It would be like Tiffany's studio. He'd have rows of painters of different grades, and they exported and sold at all the world's fairs. So I went back into Cliff and I took in these two pieces. I'll never forget this because this is our first deal. And I'm thinking, I don't know. So he goes, well, what do you want for him? I said, I want $12,500 for the two. And then his next question is, what did you pay? And I said, I'm not telling you what I paid. You know, I said, do you want to buy them? He says, I have an idea. So I said, well, I'll listen. He says, I'll pay you half of your cost, and we'll split half of the profit I sell from the gallery. I said, so I figured it up real quick that, you know, he'd have to sell them for like $16,000 for me to get back to my 12. But if he sold them for more, obviously I'm going to make more on the deal, and I have working capital 50% back in my pocket. So I did the deal with him. And from that day on, for 20 years, I went to London and bought. I went to Japan and bought. And we opened up a sword gallery inside of his shop, a Netsky collection there. And I sold Japanese screens and just all kinds of things because he would market it. They put together a very nice catalog like the one that Bryce and Don put together. But it would be every 3 months featuring the items they wanted to sell. So anyway, that's kind of the history. And the more that you see, it's like anything, it takes a really unusual piece to get you excited, you know, now. So like I scan the internet day and night, the auctions everywhere. And I mean, I could look at, in a week, I'll look at 5,000 pieces. And at the end of the week, I have 3 saved. And hope that the other guys with the equal expertise don't have them saved too, which unfortunately, that's when the battle royale starts. But so basically, I'll just give you a little rundown. This scroll here is painted in Meiji period. It's dated. I acquired it about 15 years ago, and it's signed, dated, and Emperor Meiji himself viewed this scroll in an exhibition. It has the imperial kiku on each side, flower and stream. It's portraying an earlier scene of Tokugawa Ieyasu, who was the emperor that combined all of the different, like there used to be warring states everywhere. So all of these, if you look at it, you'll see they're all, the ones in the center have daimyo hats on. A daimyo is the head of their province. So like Hizen province, Satsuma province. You each had your own individual army. You each had your own individual castle. And so he's inside the ox cart here. And if you look, everyone's bowing to him because he actually united all of Japan. So it's an interesting historical. And you'll see archers, armor boxes. If you study the hats like the shark fin hats are usually archers' hats because they have to be able to view so that the helmets don't come down so far. Here's a full suit of daimyo armor. That would be for a high-ranking samurai. But it's a very interesting scroll, and I haven't had it out until the exhibition.
I want to interrupt
Yeah.
for 1 second. He mentioned these things called kikus, and then on this vase up here, I always call them mon.
Oh, yeah, sure.
But these are the crests or the coat of arms.
Yeah, family moan.
Coats of arms. So in England, you have a coat of arms and a crown or a sword or an arm on it. In Japan, you have a mon or a kiku, and that identified that this was made for that family. So, continue.
Yeah. Well, while he was showing you that, why don't you tell them about this piece, Don? Because it's a really interesting.
This is called Kokyu Mizu, and it's probably from 1670 to 1690. And it's a low fire. It's not porcelain. It's when they just started firing things a lot hotter. and the surfaces were hard. So this is high fire porcelain, which is 300 or 400 degrees hotter than the traditional Japanese ceramic, like the Satsuma is a low fire ceramic. This is a very early piece, and it would have been made for an imperial family. It almost always came in just 3 colors, the blue, the green, and then with gilding on it. So these are very highly prized and extremely rare things.
And to mention one thing, this one's nicer than the one in the Metropolitan Museum.
And just, we've had several people come in who have said, shouldn't these things be repatriated? Should these things go back to Japan because they were taken out of their country? What most people don't realize is Japan was only conquered once in its entire existence, and that was from 1945 till 1952 when the Americans occupied Japan. Before that, Japan had never been conquered, never been occupied, and all of these things left Japan on their own volition. The Portuguese were in Japan they first landed in 1650, and by 1635 to 1639, the Japanese were done with them, kicked them all out, and forbade any ships to come into any Japanese harbors. And not until 1854 when Admiral Perry, who was an American naval officer, he brought a bunch of ships in, and that's when they started signing contracts with the government and trading. And many of these things were made specifically for export. From the mid-1800s to the early 1900s, there were massive exhibitions all over Europe, the United States. There were World's Fairs, the Pan Am Exhibition, the Crystal Palace in England.
Chicago Exhibition.
And like this piece would have been made for one of those exhibitions. So Japan was a major exporter of goods. A lot of people don't realize, but China imported huge quantities of porcelain from Japan because the Japanese, for some reason, could make them cheaper. And some Chinese liked the taste of Japanese wares. Likewise, China exported to Japan. So it's a misnomer that people think all these things were raped from Japan and never happened. So
Yeah, well, for instance, this lantern here, it's signed, if you look on the one panel here with the insects, it has the artist's name. He exhibitioned in 3 World's Fairs, and he's noted for making monumental pieces using 2 to 3 sections. So this would be an Arita lantern. It's made in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections. But what's rare to find a lantern like this, number 1. Number 2, the condition is very good. There's one little restoration on the top. But so you can, if you Google World's Fair Exhibitions Japanese Pavilion, you'll see thousands of great pieces of Meiji art, like the Tokyo School bronzes. That's a category that I've been buying a lot of because there's the lady with the basket, the lady with the baby. Here's a hunter, but they're pretty much made for Western taste. But the thing is, there has never been a book written on them, and they're undervalued for what they are. They're put together, some are cast in one piece, some are cast with hands and birds separate. There's about 10 different artists that did them, and you want to tell them about?
Well, up until the late 1800s, Japanese art showed things like dragons, geishas, samurais, all the elite. This is what you saw when you looked at images of Japan. And it wasn't until the late 1800s when the Tokyo School started making these bronzes that showed everyday life in Japan. You could look at these pieces and you could see the folds in their skin, their hair, everything. They're very human. You can tell that this big bundle of wood has real weight to it on her. You can tell that she's toiling. And up until this period, you never saw this in Japanese art.
Can you talk just a minute about some of the Western influence on these pieces?
Well, for a couple of hundred, the Portuguese started bringing in, when they came in from 1650 to 1560 to 1639, they would bring in images of engravings, European engravings, small paintings, and then around 1850, when the Americans came in, they brought in lots of photographs of things, and they started trading these things. And the Japanese saw that there was another way to portray their art. You know, the Europeans in Michelangelo and Da Vinci's time, there was a notion that to show real humans, when you look at a Michelangelo or you look at a Da Vinci drawing, you can see emotion, you can see feelings, you can see you can see pain in a dead Christ. And that happened in Europe in the late 1400s, early 1500s. That notion didn't come to Japan until very late on, but they did it beautifully. And you see this woman breastfeeding. It's something never would have been shown in Japan prior to this time. And again, they were mainly for export, but a lot of them stuck around Japan. And from that time on, like if you look at Netzikis, Netzikis will get very, very elaborate and perfect, and they show every little aspect of life. Like, this animal back here in the painting, he's getting a bug that he's going to eat. That's a notion that came late in Japan. Previous to that, it was birds sitting in trees, with gilded backgrounds, and it's sort of a nice thing to see the evolution of what happened in Japanese art.
Yeah, I collect Japanese albums, photo albums too. I have maybe, I don't know, a ton. Boxes and crates because I collected them for over 30 years. But in the hand-tinted albumen prints, you'll see the same subjects. And there was a German artist that was real famous there, and a French artist, and then the Japanese. But the albums were made 1880 to 1910. And they usually have really elaborate lacquer cases, and then they show sumo wrestlers, everyday life at gardens, shrines, and you can almost match up some of the Tokyo School bronzes. You can almost find a photograph of the lady walking down the street just like that that's hand-tinted. So basically, the Japanese screens, which the earliest one is the one here, they're always made with 3 layers of paper, meaning you'll find a seam. The widest paper they could make is about 18 inches. So if you look close, you'll see it seamed in pieces, the screens. That one there is probably late 17th, early 18th century. And the next one over with the gold leaf, the earlier ones with really fine gold leaf, if you walk across that one, you'll see that you can see the squares of gold leaf, which are typical. They're about 5-inch squares, but the gold leaf oxidizes. So a very early one, you'll see that a lot of the gilt is very oxidized. And this one is Scenes of Kyoto, which once again is everyday life, because the Americans were so intrigued by the Asians and the Europeans that it became quite, in the late 1900s, there were full rooms of Japanese decor. If you look at, some of the bigger world travelers that were there, they would completely decorate accents like French furniture, Japanese porcelain. They would mix it with everything. I'll tell you about these dogs, and then we'll take a break, and you guys can look around, and then we'll have a question and answer. I'm always fond, as my wife says, if it's big and heavy, I buy it. And I got 30 12th century sculptures out of stone that 4 guys have to move every one of them. But these are Japanese bronze. They're called shishi dogs. The Chinese they're Buddhist lions. So there's many terms, fu dog, shishi dog, but these are actually Japanese shishi dogs. And these are a recent acquisition. They came up in a silver sale of all things, European silver. and these were stuck in there. And but this pair is virtually identical to a pair that's in the museum in Japan. That a prince, Japanese prince from the royal family, built this magnificent Art Deco home in the 1920s. And outside the home is almost the identical pair of these bronzes. And they're cast and then all hand chased. These are, the patina you see is from being outside, which is where most of them are. I have one bigger one that's probably about the size of that table. And then I also like Japanese temple lanterns, which are, I have a few 14-foot high. But the Japanese gardens in San Francisco, there's a tea garden there. If you Google that, you'll see a big Buddha seated, which is, and I just recently acquired one of those. And it was in a small auction. This is the scan 10,000 things and find one. So I went, boom, I got to get this. So it's in a small auction, and you could see it was in a Japanese garden, and it was like Greenwich, Connecticut. It had been grown over. So the garden was probably magnificent in the 40s, and then nobody really kept it. So this Buddha's sitting around all it grown over, and I had to get it. I was on the phone bidding because I didn't want the computer to glitch. And then they missed my bid because that could happen if you really want to go crazy. But yeah, these are in the San Francisco Art Museum has a pair that, or a matched pair, which I used to own. And so, you know, it's a pretty, we tried to make it as much variety as we could with the space that we have. So, you know, there's a lot of different mediums here. But why don't you guys just take a break, look around, and then we'll sit down, and then if you have questions on each piece or a piece, I'll be happy to answer, and I get Don to help me. Okay, so
I got a question.
okay.
Question time, right?
Question time, yes.
Okay, first question.
Okay. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Mark, I remember a long time ago when you were living on the island,
Yeah,
you'd have all the Japanese swords up.
yeah.
To me, they all look the same. You'd say that was $100 and that was $5,000. You want to talk through how you knew that?
It's called study. But it's pretty you can equate Japanese swords to diamonds. That's the easiest way, okay? You can lay out 5 1-carat diamonds. One can be super clear. The next one can have brilliant color. The next one has inclusions. The next one's cut bad. The table's too short. And the next one is synthetic. So my point is, on Japanese swords, every period has great makers. So it can be an 800-year-old piece of junk. I mean, if the guy, so swords are made by laminating steel. So they pound it, they fold it, they pound it, they fold it, they pound it, they fold it, they pound it, they fold it. Then it's water tempered. So they put a clay. The temper lines are anything from choji temper, which is like this, to suguha temper, which is just a straight thin line. And then each area did different tempers. So basically, the way they rate them, the Japanese ratings for swords goes Chu, Chujo, Jo, Jojo, Saijo. So on a 1 to 5, that equates to an American ratings of 10 points to 300 points. So, for instance, in some, like Satsuma province, swords, people love them. They're always wide. They have a fish belly tang, which is it comes in flat, and then it has like a sweeping fish belly tang. And like certain Bizen swords, the Japanese love Bizen swords. Satsuma swords, Americans and Europeans pay the most for. Yeah, go ahead.
You might want to tell them about the waves in the sword and why they're laminated, why the different metals.
Yeah, well, so for instance, when a sword hits, if it's one solid tempered piece, it'll snap. But if it's laminated steel, the impact, at the most will put a small chip on the cutting edge. So that's the way, and you can multiply it each time, double, double, double. So you can actually have a sword that's 20,000 folds, because 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, onward and onward. So then, as far as value goes, I had a collector friend, he passed away. He was a big orange grower in Florida. And all he wanted to buy, I'll tell you what, is Ubu one-hole swords. So when a sword is first made, the machi is where there's a little habaki that holds the suba on. So the machi is the cut on the top where this little sleeve fits. Then the seppa, which is a washer, then the suba, then a seppa, then the suka, which is the handle. So ubu one hole means the original time it was made with this shaped tang with one hole. Now, if it's 16th century, let's say it's 14th century, the next generation guy used a shorter sword. He clipped the end of the tang, that's called siriagi, and they clip the tang and add an extra hole an inch down. So that sword is an altered sword. So unless it's a super famous maker, the value's like 40% off right away. And then in the early blades, like the Kamakura period, obviously there's not many out there, and they call them Osuriagi. I bought one. I'll give you a funny story. I'm at the Syracuse gun show. This is years ago. And I'm looking at a sword. There's a certain way you hold them. I got it on the light. I'm looking at it, and I see down the hallway 2 veterans from World War II, old guys, walk in. And the Shirosaya is the storage case. It's a plain, no mounts. And it had Sayagaki. Sayagaki is, it'll say the attribution or the owner's name or the date. So I saw it. I dropped the sword. I ran over there because this thing was like this wide. So, I mean, I know by the size of the saya what kind of blade's going to be in there. So I go, are you here to sell it? Oh, yeah, I got it, World War II. So I said, can I look at it? And he goes, so the rules of the show is whoever has it in their hand is the one that gets to negotiate, unless you're a jerk, and then you have to tell them to, pound sand. So anyway, so I had it. And I'm looking at it, and this thing was a masterpiece. So I'm thinking, here comes 3 Japanese collectors. Here comes my competition. It's like they're coming in. My time is getting... So I looked the guy up. I said, I don't know what he wants. I'll just throw him. I said, I'll give you 2,000. Oh, he goes like this. I'll take it. So I pay him his 2,000. And then his friend with him is like laughing out loud, the guy that walked in with him. And I said, I just got to ask you one question. What's so damn funny? He goes, my buddy said the first guy that offered him 500 would get the sword. And anyway, that sword turned out to be, I sent it to Japan to the Japanese Sword Museum. It's called the Nihon Token Kai. And the curator was there, and he saw my sword. I'd show him to him, and he wanted to specially handle it for grading. So it turned out the sword was Osuriagi, which means the whole name was cut off because Nambokacho period's in the 1400s, 1380s. So the whole end was cut off. The bohi, the big grooves, ran all the way out and through the end of the sword. But it turned out to be attributed to Bungo Tomoyuki, the founding father of that school, Bungo Takata School, and the sword was very thick. And I got Juyo papers, which means important, not important cultural treasure, just important treasure. Because the higher you go up, there's Tokubetsu Juyo, you're not supposed to take out of the country. So if you get a paper that's too high, or it's too rare, you can own it, but it has to stay in Japan. So anyway, the sword was fantastic. I had it polished, everything, and there was a surgeon in Seattle that collected swords, Dr. Yang, and I showed it to him, and he goes, I want this bad. And so I ended up trading him from his collection, I think 12 very good swords, but not Juyo quality. Easy to sell. They were like, 4,000, 5,000, 8,000. But I traded him 12 swords for the one sword, which I sold immediately. Because the buyers, it's like anything. Once you hit 50,000 and up, the customer base is reduced. There's plenty of doctors, lawyers, independent businessmen that'll buy a sword for 6,000, 8,000, 12,000. But when you get over 100,000, the most I ever sold one for was 250,000 to a collector in San Francisco. And that sword I actually sold twice. But it started out, it started out, my friend bought it at a gun show for 3,000. Then he ended up trading it and selling it for like 70,000. Then the guy sent it to the museum and it got the papers. And then we sold it to an Indonesian royal family member who lived in Houston. Then he passed away. My friend's gun store got the sword back on consignment. And then I sold it to a collector but it was by Muramasa. And Muramasa, it's rare to find a signature by him because one of the emperors was killed, or one of his high-ranking nobles was killed by a sword made by that guy. So he had him take the name off of any sword with Muramasa. They had to chisel the name off. And if you were found with one with the name, you would be executed. So this is one of the few that made it all the way from, he worked in like 1550. And it was one of the few that made it through unchanged, Ubu one hole, unchanged by a super famous guy. All right, any more questions? Go ahead.
One of the things that early on in Japan, they figured out a way, because some people were making swords with soft steel, which doesn't hold the sharpness well. They dull very quickly. Hard steel holds the sharpness, but they're brittle, so the swords would break. So they developed a way of laminating the steel. When you look at a really good blade, you'll see waves in them. And that's the steel folded over, heated up, hammered out, folded over again, heated up, hammered out. So you get dozens or hundreds of layers.
It could be thousands.
And you can see these tiny, and the best sword makers made them so the waves are very uniform and perfect. It's almost an art form just to see the waves and the blades, how beautiful they are. But it's for a purpose.
Well, I've seen a railroad tie cut in half with a sword.
Yeah, well, there's old movies of guys. My first sword I probably bought when I was 14, I tried to chop my neighbor's palm tree in half. I got it stuck in there, but when I was a kid, I did some crazy stuff. But, I went out there and luckily it didn't cut the guy's palm tree down. I'd have been buying him a new palm tree, but I said, it didn't go through. But the most unique sword I had was gold inlay, 5-body cutting test to the mound. So they would take convicts and stack them up. So 5 convicts stacked up. They had sword testers, and the guys were rated. And so this sword went through 5 bodies to the mound, and it was dated 1648, tested by the famous maker. And then it said what kind of cuts. There were 16 different cuts they would test. And at one time, I had like 5 gold inlaid cutting tests in stock, which they're very rare. But, that was one thing that was very desirable for collecting. Okay.
Any other questions about work that's in the show?
Anything about any of the Japanese items?
The painting over in the corner is a very elegant one, very simple. Some of these are big, like, presentation pieces. Like, what context would we see that in? Is that, like, for someone's home?
This was by an artist named Hiroshige, who did 100 Views of Tokyo. Very, very famous painter. Was famous for very painterly, singular items, and they're extremely rare. Very few of them ever left the country. but that is a Hiroshige piece.
And it's more of a scholar's. There's
Yeah,
a whole group of scholars' paintings, which can be, it's like you would say, Renaissance drawings, you know, like just a hand is, so that falls into like a scholar's scroll. Chinese scholars' art is very valuable right now.
There are items that were made just for a scholar's table, someone to sit and do calligraphy, or so they would have a little lacquer tray with a vase, a little, maybe a tea jar, which is, there's a tamba jar here. These are ceramic tea jars, but they're almost always very simple and very plain, so that people could reflect on things. You know, it was so that people could come up with poetry, so that you could write, so that you could think clearly. I think it would be kind of hard to think clearly, or you know.
Yeah, even with this, I mean, this is a whole different function than that. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
very elegant or
Yeah.
poetic.
I mean, like scholars' pieces, for instance, there's a gourd there. See those 3 gourd there for sake or tea? All 3 of those are very early and Japanese taste, meaning for the consumer in Japan, where the big flashy pieces are made for export. So, I mean, like,
It's easier.
yeah.
It's the ultimate in Japanese ceramic for homegrown taste, not for export. That when you could get drips that were this perfect, it didn't go down to the end, something like be broken off. They're very uniform, they're organic, they almost look like a vine growing, something that happened in nature. And that's what the traditional Japanese taste, the scholars' taste, was simple things that look like, this is an actual gourd. I mean, but it's made to hold sake. So people think this is ceramic, or this grew, you know, in the summer in someone's yard, and they made it into a sake jar. So that
Don, would they have built a form around that gourd for it to grow into?
not this one, but they did that. Sometimes they would carve wooden molds, 2-piece molds. They would have the mon, you know, the Japanese crest on it, or a decoration on it. And when a gourd started growing outside, they would take this wooden mold and they would put it over the small gourd. So as the gourd grew, it would grow into the mold. And when it was fully grown, they would cut it off. And after it dried, they'd take the mold off, and you'd have a piece that was formed with decoration on it. So that was considered.
These are traditional Japanese too. This is a pair of iron teapots, but what's very nice, it's a matched pair that's been kept together. But not only that, the lacquered lids are 18th century. So this is very early Japanese lacquer. It has a Nishiji background, which is the super fine Japanese lacquer. But the patina on the lacquer, it's oxidized because it's 200 years old, rather than a Meiji period gold lacquer box like in there, which is still brilliant gold. It hasn't been in the air long enough. But like, it's rare to find pairs of teapots, and especially rare to find with the original old lacquer tops. Any more questions?
I'd like to know about the bronze, is that what it is?
The plaque,
The black one?
this?
Yes.
This is Japanese mixed metal. So when this Emperor Meiji stopped the ruling class of samurai, which means all the fine sword makers from making the tsubas inlaid in gold and everything, they went into art objects. So this is attributed to Chokichi. He's one of the famous mixed metal artists. And so you have a bronze back, copper, silver, shibuichi, that's another alloy, shakudo, gold. So for instance, this one leaf here starts out with a bronze back, then they hammered copper, sintoku, that's another alloy. So there's 7 different alloys of metal that the Japanese use. So when you look at it, it's fine, handly chase. So the chase work is comparable to the fine Japanese sword guards, fuchikasha, the manuki under the handle. But all of them got put out of business because Emperor Meiji put a stop to carrying samurais. And every area had fine metal makers. So that's why in Meiji period, you start seeing fantastic metalwork from Japan, like unbelievable pieces, because these guys were masters of small chisel work and patinas and everything. So if you were in, they would be like first generation, second generation, apprentice too. If you translate the signature of a very nice piece and you'll research the guy, you'll find out he could be fourth generation Kaga school, and they would take these guys under their wings and have them teach them their techniques. And now there's some modern Netsuke carvers that are Japanese and American and English, and the prices are pretty good that they're making. But the time to make and the expertise to make something like this, most people wouldn't have the skill or the time. You can buy an older one cheaper than you could try to find a master Japanese artist that's new to make it. And that's one thing good about investing in antiques, at least my theory is, you can't cast, if you had to recast these, you would never get the patina to begin with, but all of this is hand chased too. So if you try to make a reproduction of this, China reproduces everything now. European bronzes, you name it. But the bottom line is, if you put the real one next to the new one, the quality and the finish work is not there, because this was someone's livelihood, not for commercial. That was what they did. I mean, it wasn't so much a commercial usage. Now it's more production.
Here's one that is similar to the one on the wall. This one's iron. It's made completely out of iron, except it's got little bits of copper and silver inlaid in the leaf that over time they oxidize differently and give you the effect of a leaf as it's browning. And then it's covered with actual sheet gold that is worked onto the surface. It gives it a perfect, beautiful surface. But the base is just iron.
And Tiffany copied, when Tiffany did and Gorham silver, they both copied in the 1920s Japanese style vases, teapots. But I've had a lot of beautiful Japanese metalwork over the years. I mean, if I had it all back, I'd have probably one of the best collections ever, because I've had almost every big name maker that there is.
If you look really close on this one, I'll have it sitting over here, but there's silver in the top here, just a tiny bit of silver inlaid in this leaf. And then this is a finger citron, which is a fruit, and it's cut out, and there's gold bands of gold actually hammered into it and perfectly smooth. So it actually.
Can you lift that end up I want to just get that box. I want to show them this little box. Huh?
Yeah. Hey, Mark,
Yeah.
you want me to explain how these are done?
Yeah, sure.
Just
get that.
You should lift it up.
I'm a sculptor, and I do custom work in different, very similar to these, and I do small pieces. Anyway, in order to, these are so much more complicated to make than you could possibly imagine. What they do is like this: they start out with a sheet of fairly thick bronze or copper or silver or whatever, and then they take and they chisel out the shapes of the flowers and the butterfly and the bird and all that. So they cut with a chisel, they cut out that shape, but they cut it out so that it's the thickness of the metal that is going to go on top of it. And then the edges are dovetailed so that they are cut in. So then they take the bronze or the shakado, or shakado is copper and gold and silver and so forth anyway.
and then they take and they hammer those in so that they go into the dovetails, and the metal that's the gold that's on top of that, then they take that leaf and they do the same thing where the gold is going to go, and then they chisel all of that out. So it's just very time consuming and just incredible craftsmanship go into creating it.
It's super time consuming.
Yeah, it really is.
Mark, I'm sorry, before you do that, so we're coming up on an hour.
Okay,
So we'll
this
do-
will be my,
We'll do that, and if maybe
One more
or two
question.
questions, but otherwise, we'll wrap
this
up.
is a snuff box that's 17th century Japanese. And if you just look at it's shakudo with gold inlay. Now this is a European hinge they added on later. It's got a gilt interior, but the background is called Nanako, and each individual microscopic circle is with a little hammer and chisel is tapped one at a time. So if you look at the texture on the back, you can barely see. It has a lot of patina because this has been used a lot. But these are really rare to find. I've had this one for years because this technique would have been made when the sword fittings were made. So to find a snuff box, it would have been, a custom order for somebody. But the patina in the background, though, is almost, if you use a magnifying glass, the rows are almost perfect. You see the little small circles all in the background there? See, they're super, almost like a pinhead or a needle point. So they make the design, then at the end they finish it by just tap, 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 but perfect rows. Okay, we'll take one last question.
Yeah, and Mark, I think you're going to be here, so if people
I'll be here a few minutes.
approach him
Yeah.
individually, that's fine.
Any questions? I'm looking at this side first, and we're moving along. And now we're in the middle. No hands are up, and we're on the left. And the horse is about to go through the gate, and we're over here, and bing! It's over.